My name is Claire Vance, and I'm 38 years old. Last Christmas Eve, my mother stood at the head of a massive dining table, looked out at 20 of our relatives, and announced with a proud smile, "Our eldest daughter married a senior partner at a Wall Street hedge fund, and our youngest? She's fixing routers for the state." The entire dining room went dead silent. Then, my father pulled a crisp $100 bill out of his wallet, slid it across the white linen tablecloth right up to me, and stared me dead in the eye. "Here you go, geek," he said. "Go fix the Wi-Fi upstairs." Nobody laughed. My sister Chloe just stood there holding her champagne flute, smirking behind her glass. I didn't even blink. I took that Benjamin, folded it neatly in half, slipped it into my coat pocket, and calmly said, "Thanks, Dad." What they didn't know was that for the last 15 years, I had been building a massive defense system far beyond anything they could ever comprehend. And my 80-year-old grandfather, Arthur, the only person in that room who knew the truth, had finally had enough. He slowly pushed back his chair, stood up, turned to my mother, and said the exact words that would utterly shatter the rest of the night. But before I tell you what happened next, please take a quick second to like this video and subscribe, especially if you've ever been completely underestimated by your own family. And let me know in the comments below where you're watching from and what time it is over there right now. To really understand how we ended up at that dinner table, we have to go back. My mother grew up in a broke Rust Belt family in Gary, Indiana. In 1985, the bank foreclosed on her childhood home, and she swore she'd never live like that again. She ended up marrying my dad, a manager at an auto parts plant in the suburbs of Chicago. For the next 40 years, her absolute obsession was making sure everyone knew her daughters were going to climb the social ladder. They were going to marry the kind of men who could provide the luxury she never had. I was born in 1988, 3 years after Chloe. Back then, we lived in a cramped brick house in Berwyn, a blue-collar neighborhood where nobody had any secrets. My mother was a stay-at-home mom who spent her days flipping through Forbes and Vogue, plotting out futures for her daughters that had absolutely nothing to do with who we actually were. Chloe was perfection personified. Blonde hair, blue eyes, naturally photogenic. She got expensive tennis lessons at the country club, while I got a second-hand keyboard and taught myself to code in a dark basement where nobody bothered me. By the time Chloe was 12, my mother was already teaching her how to hold a wine glass properly, how to command a conversation at dinner parties, and how to become the kind of woman a successful man would want to marry. When I was 12, my mother only ever asked me why I couldn't be more likable like my sister. I remember being 10 years old, sitting at the top of the stairs, and hearing my mother on the phone with my aunt. She said, "Chloe is going places. As for Claire, well, let's just hope she doesn't starve." I went back to my room that night and didn't even come out for dinner. That dynamic followed us all the way through high school. When Chloe got straight A's, the family celebrated with a lavish dinner at a high-end steakhouse on Michigan Avenue. When I got an A- in AP Physics and Calculus, all I got was a frown from my mother and a sharp, "Why wasn't it an A+?" When I won third place in the Illinois Youth Coding Championship with a project analyzing security vulnerabilities in Chicago's municipal network, my parents didn't even show up to the award ceremony. They were way too busy helping Chloe pick out luxury decor for her high-end student apartment at Northwestern University. Our refrigerator was covered in Chloe's achievements, report cards, cheerleading photos, and Ivy League-level acceptance letters. My coding medal was banished to a far corner, half hidden behind a grocery list, dangling precariously from a single tiny magnet. When Chloe easily transitioned into Northwestern and started mixing with the wealthy fraternity crowd, my mother popped champagne. When I announced I was going to the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, her face completely fell. Urbana-Champaign? Claire, that's just a state school. Couldn't you apply somewhere respectable? I got a full-ride scholarship, I told her. My major is cybersecurity and computer science. My mother repeated the words computer technician, like she was swallowing a fly, adding, "What kind of future is there in that anyway?" I didn't bother answering. I had realized a long time ago that my mother didn't actually care about the answer. She just wanted to replicate Chloe's life path, and I was never going to give her that. What I didn't know at the time was that my grandfather, Arthur, had been quietly watching all of this go down. Grandpa was a retired Navy logistics officer who went on to spend 30 years as a dispatcher at the Southside shipyards. He had watched heavy industry collapse, and he understood the raw infrastructure that actually keeps society moving. He had tried to teach my mother that honest hard work carries its own dignity, but the only lesson she took away from her childhood was that working with your hands meant you were a total failure. In the fall of 2006, just a few weeks before I was supposed to move to campus, I took the train down to the South Side to visit him. His old one-bedroom apartment was packed with military logistics manuals, power grid blueprints, and infrastructure schematics. He poured me a cup of black coffee from his vintage pot, and we sat by the window, watching the snowplows struggle to clear the streets below. "Your mother thinks success means living in a North Shore mansion and being a trophy wife," Grandpa said softly. "But it took me 40 years to realize that real success is keeping the power on and the communications running. It's being the person who holds up the umbrella in a storm. Which one do you want to be?" I looked down at the Midwestern power grid maps spread across his table. I saw the nodes marked with red warning signs, the system vulnerabilities, the fragile communication protocols. I saw patterns I could understand and crises I desperately wanted to fix. "The second one," I said firmly. Grandpa smiled. "Good. If you've got the stomach for it, I want to show you what that actually looks like." He pulled out a thick security brief, detailing the invisible threats facing city water grids, traffic signals, and regional hospital systems due to outdated technology. "These are the invisible battlefields," he said. "This is the trenches your mother is so desperate to escape. If you choose this path, she will never understand it. In fact, she'll be ashamed of it. Can you handle that?" I thought about Chloe's report cards on the fridge, my coding medal shoved into the corner, and the look of pure disgust on my mother's face when I said the words, "state school." "I can handle it," I told him. That September, I started college. I focused my entire degree on the cyber defense of critical infrastructure. I also took a part-time job at the campus computer lab, making $10 an hour cleaning malware off student laptops and maintaining servers. When my mother found out, she acted like it was a public humiliation. "You're fixing computers? Claire, that is so beneath you. Couldn't you get a respectable internship at a PR firm?" "This job is respectable," I said. To which she replied, "To people with status, that's called manual labor." I didn't argue. I just stayed glued to my monitor. I patched vulnerabilities, traced virus origins, and began noticing major architectural flaws affecting the security of the entire campus system. I started logging the data and bringing the issues to my advisor. One of my professors, a man who had previously worked for the Department of Defense, saw my potential. "Claire," he told me one afternoon in his office, which was piled high with hard drives, "you don't just want to patch code, you want to rebuild the entire defense framework. That kind of intuition is incredibly rare. Don't waste it." He handed me an internal application for the state government's cyber emergency response team. "This work isn't glamorous," he warned. "You'll be dealing with baseline ransomware and data garbage, but you will learn exactly how the lifeblood of this country runs behind the scenes." I brought the application home and left it on the kitchen island. My mother walked by and casually shoved it aside to make room for Chloe's thick, custom wedding planning binder. By then, Chloe was engaged to Miles, a rising financial star at a top-tier Loop hedge fund. They had met back when Chloe was working as a high-end pharmaceutical representative. She had used her prestigious degree not for research, but to leverage her looks and social skills to sell high-margin drugs. Within 6 months, she had locked her sights on Miles at an industry cocktail mixer. 2 years later, they were engaged. My mother called it destiny. I called it a targeted investment. The wedding took place in June 2011 at a private North Shore country club that my parents absolutely could not afford. There were 300 guests, a live chamber orchestra, and my mother wore a champagne-colored silk gown that she had saved up 6 months to buy. As a bridesmaid, I was stuffed into a hideously ill-fitting pale yellow dress. In every single wedding video and photo, I was pushed out to the absolute edge, practically invisible, while Chloe and Miles stood glowing at the center of the universe. At the reception, my mother raised her glass and said, "A toast to my 2 daughters." But her eyes were locked onto Chloe, never wandering to me for even a fraction of a second. I slipped out onto the terrace and texted my grandfather saying, "I'm fine, just counting down the minutes until I can leave." He texted back immediately, "You left them a long time ago, kiddo. They're just too blind to see it." He was completely right. By that time, I had already been accepted into Purdue University's master's program for information security. That fall, I packed my things and moved 2 hours away. Aside from the mandatory major holidays, I never looked back. If this story sounds familiar to you, and if you've ever been the invisible person whose achievements were erased just because you didn't fit the family script, drop a comment below. I'd really love to hear your story. During my 2 years at Purdue, I lived in a cheap basement apartment, survived on instant ramen, and wrote a definitive thesis on resilient defenses for municipal transit networks against distributed denial of service attacks. My thesis committee was completely blown away. The department head asked me if I would consider heading out to Silicon Valley for a massive paycheck. I told him that I had a far more important responsibility waiting for me back in Chicago, and that I was starting my new job the following week. In June 2013, just 3 days after successfully defending my thesis, I became a senior threat analyst for the Illinois Cybersecurity Agency. My starting salary was $42,000. I was given a tiny cubicle on the 13th floor of an inconspicuous government building downtown. The nameplate on my desk simply read, "Vance, Technician," right next to a framed photo of my grandfather, Arthur. My job was to monitor anomalous traffic, investigate hacker intrusions targeting state hospitals, and respond to public digital security crises. There was absolutely no glamour in it, but lives were quite literally on the line. During my first year on the job, my team responded to a devastating ransomware attack aimed at 3 major emergency rooms in Southside Chicago. I worked for 36 consecutive hours, coordinating field engineers, blocking malicious nodes, and rebuilding encrypted databases. We successfully protected the life support networks of those hospitals and prevented a massive medical shutdown. I received an internal commendation from the governor's office. My family knew absolutely nothing about it. That year at Thanksgiving, someone around the table asked about my work. Before I could even open my mouth, my mother cut in. She told everyone that Claire was working for the state, just doing basic computer repair and things like that. She gave a little apologetic smile to the room and called me a government network admin. 20 people offered polite, empty nods and immediately changed the subject. Chloe was pregnant with her first child at the time, so the conversation instantly shifted to the custom decor for the nursery and the massive year-end bonus Miles was about to bring home. I sat there, calmly finished cutting the food on my plate, and left the party early. Grandpa called me that night to check in. When he asked how bad it was, I told him it was the same old story. He asked when I was finally going to tell them what I actually ran. I asked him why I should even care, because they did not want to know the truth. They just needed a loser script that fit their worldview, so I was fine with letting them have it. I heard him take a long, deep sigh on the other end of the line. He told me that one day they were going to run straight into a brick wall, and he could not wait to see the looks on their faces. I told him that if that day ever came, he would be the first person I'd call, but I was not holding my breath. I truly believed I would spend the rest of my life being dismissed by the people who were supposed to know me best. I had fully accepted that reality. I just had no idea how quickly the world was about to change. In the spring of 2015, I was promoted to Chief Security Analyst. I started managing a team of 12 elite hackers and engineers. My salary bumped up to $68,000. During a Sunday dinner, I casually mentioned the promotion. My father told me that was nice, and my mother asked if it was some kind of foreman position. I told her it was something like that, to which she replied, "So a foreman for fixing computers." I did not bother correcting her. By 2017, I received another accelerated promotion, this time to Regional Cyber Threat Intelligence Director. I was 29 years old, commanding 60 agent-level security experts, and managing a budget of nearly $10 million. At a federal hearing, several high-ranking committee members aggressively questioned me about my young age. I completely shut them down with my flawless track record, a 100% data recovery rate over 2 years, and an ironclad system simulation. I took the position based on absolute merit. I was the youngest director in the history of the agency. The outside world was full of skeptics, but I spent the entire next year earning their complete respect. My mother never once asked about my new title. Whenever outsiders asked her about me, she would just say that Claire was floating around in some government logistics department. She would tell people we were not entirely sure what she did, but it was probably just installing antivirus software. Between 2018 and 2019, I spearheaded an unprecedented department restructuring that merged the State Police Cybercrime Unit, the Municipal Power Grid Defense Center, and the Healthcare Data Protection Bureau into one single unified command center. It was a brutal political dogfight. I sat in tense legislative committee rooms, building alliances and defending my proposal using disaster simulation data that they could not possibly argue against. In the end, the bill passed by a razor-thin margin. In 2020, my title became Midwest Executive Director for Critical Infrastructure Defense. My staff surged to 200 people, and my salary crossed the $150,000 threshold. I was responsible for approving compliance contracts for dozens of massive financial institutions and hospitals, coordinating interstate emergency response protocols, and reporting directly to the Federal Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. That Christmas, my mother asked if I was still grinding away at that same government department. I told her yes. She nodded and immediately turned to Chloe, telling her to hurry up and tell everyone about the new yacht Miles had just bought. The conversation drifted away again. I chose to stay silent because by then I saw right through it. My mother did not want the truth. The truth was too blinding. It would completely ruin the careful self-delusion she had maintained for 30 years, which was that Chloe was the ultimate winner, and I was the loser scraping for leftovers. Letting her continue to believe I was a low-level tech support worker was much easier than forcing her to change her deep-rooted prejudice. Then, a global systemic crisis hit. In 2021, ransomware attacks targeting domestic infrastructure swept across the country like a tsunami. I was 33 years old. The entire digital defense network of the Midwest was hanging by a thread. Overnight, my department became the absolute front line of national security. We urgently coordinated physical isolation protocols for the entire regional power grid, distributed high-level encryption keys to over 40 state agencies, and implemented top-secret system circuit breakers for field hospitals everywhere. With the help of federal emergency funding, my budget exploded to $85 million. My staff of 200 worked around the clock in shifts. I was putting in 80 hours a week. At 2 a.m, I would get direct calls from the office of the FBI director. I maintained real-time connections with every major financial clearing center and top hospital in Chicago, which included the exact investment bank where Miles worked. My team spent every single day holding the line against foreign hackers trying to wipe out their client accounts. In June 2022, Grandpa Arthur's identity was swept up in a massive, incredibly vicious foreign medical data breach. He was not only at risk of having his life savings wiped out, but the remote monitoring port for his pacemaker was actually locked down. I utilized every ounce of my federal authority and professional network. I deployed tracking teams, seized dark web nodes, and ensured his assets were completely frozen and protected, while top-tier white hat hackers regained control of his medical device. Once the crisis was averted, I went to see him at a secure location. He looked down at the high-clearance credential badge hanging around my neck, which read, Claire Vance, Executive Director, Top Federal Security Clearance. Tears suddenly welled up in his old eyes. He asked with a trembling voice if I was the one who did it, if I was the one who mobilized those massive operations that looked straight out of a movie. I told him I just made a few phone calls. He told me that I had just saved his old life and all of his savings. I told him it was the technical experts on the ground who saved him, and that I had just provided the authorization. He squeezed my hand tightly, telling me that he read the internal briefs every day and knew exactly how high I was standing. Then he asked if my mother knew. I told him no, and that I planned to keep it a secret. When he asked why, I told him it was because I wanted to see exactly how long she could keep lying to herself. Grandpa held my hand with a grip that was frail but incredibly fierce. He made me promise him one thing. He asked me to promise that when the moment finally came, when they were forced to open their eyes and see exactly who I was, I wouldn't let them off easy. I told him I promised. 2 years later, in the fall of 2024, the state government presented me with the Distinguished Medal for Infrastructure Defense at City Hall. The governor delivered the speech himself. The flashes from the media lines were completely blinding. The business and politics section of the Chicago Tribune ran a sizable feature article, complete with a photo of me shaking hands with the governor. The headline read, "The Invisible Shield. Executive Director Claire Vance receives highest security commendation." I knew my family wouldn't show up, but Grandpa Arthur was there. He sat in the very front row of the small ceremonial hall, crying tears of pure pride. After the ceremony ended, he very carefully folded up that newspaper clipping, tucked it safely into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, and never said a single word about it to my mother. I asked him what he planned on doing with it, and he gave me a sly smile, saying it might come in handy one day, or maybe he was just waiting for the perfect time to drop a bomb. By 2025, my department was an ironclad fortress. With an $85 million budget and a staff of 230, my annual salary reached $175,000. I was appointed as a core member of the Federal Joint Cybersecurity Task Force. I was deeply embedded with multinational banks, power grid hubs, and defense contractors. I signed off on compliance certifications, and with a single stroke of my pen, I decided the flow of billions of dollars. My work was entirely invisible unless everything completely collapsed. And it did not collapse, because I was the absolute master of this field. Meanwhile, my family gatherings remained as stagnant as ever. Just last Christmas Eve, the year before everything was completely turned upside down, my mother asked me if I was still with that government department fixing computers. I told her yes. She told me that was nice and that at least it was a steady government paycheck. Her tone carried the heavy implication that a steady paycheck was synonymous with being a total dead-end failure. Then she turned to Chloe, telling everyone to listen to the great news about Miles. She announced that he was officially becoming a senior partner at the hedge fund next year, calling it a massive leap into a whole new social class. Miles gave a modest wave of his hand, and Chloe's face was glowing with pride. My mother raised her wine glass to propose a toast. I took a sip of my soda water and left the house before dessert was even served. Late that night, I was sitting in my grandfather's small South Side brick house, eating Chinese takeout straight from the cardboard boxes while an old movie played on the TV. He looked over at me and asked how much longer I was going to let this ridiculous drama play out. I told him it wouldn't be much longer. I could feel the barometric pressure shifting, and I knew a storm was coming. I was right. In early November 2025, my mother called. She told me that Christmas Eve was going to be massive this year because Chloe had the biggest news imaginable. Miles was officially a senior partner. They were hosting a huge dinner party at their mansion in Winnetka, and the entire family was coming, including uncles, aunts, and all the cousins. When I told her I'd be there on time, she said that was great, but then told me to please dress somewhat decently because she didn't want me making them look bad. After I hung up, I texted Grandpa to tell him it was a full family Christmas dinner in Winnetka, and that my mom was planning something big. He replied in a second, saying he was too. A week before Christmas, my mother called again. She asked me what she was supposed to tell the relatives when they asked what I did for a living. I told her that I worked in cyber infrastructure security for the state government. She sighed and asked what that even meant in plain English, asking if I just went from office to office running antivirus software. I told her it was close enough. She took a long sigh, telling me I always made things so difficult and asking if I could just give her a title that sounded impressive. I told her I just did. She snapped back, saying cybersecurity didn't mean anything to people, and that she was just going to tell everyone I did odds and ends in government logistics so they could actually understand it. Right after I hung up, one of my deputy directors happened to walk past my glass office and noticed the look on my face. He asked if it was my family again, and I told him it always was. He asked when I was finally going to tell them that I didn't just manage their networks, but that I practically held their lives in my hands. I looked down at the flashing radar maps on my screen and whispered that it would be very soon. The day before Christmas, I drove over to pick up Grandpa. The afternoon sun was streaming through the car windows as we drove. I told him he didn't really have to go the next day because the whole environment was just going to be exhausting. He told me he had seen plenty of exhausting things in his life. He reminded me that he had spent 30 years managing roughnecks at the shipyards, so he wasn't about to let my mother intimidate him. When I asked why he was pushing it this time, he looked at me and said it was because he was 80 years old. He told me he didn't have enough time left to sit back and watch a bunch of idiots treat a diamond like a piece of gravel. I asked him what would happen if things got completely out of hand, and he asked if it could really get any worse than them treating me like garbage. Then he reached inside his coat pocket and pulled out that 2024 newspaper clipping, along with a copy of the official document bearing the governor's seal. He asked if I was okay with him bringing them along. I stared at that clipping for a long time before slowly nodding, telling him I was ready. On Christmas Eve, I was very deliberate about what I wore. I chose a minimalist black cashmere dress without a single visible designer label. There was absolutely nothing about it that could compete with the tens of thousands of dollars of haute couture Chloe would be wearing. I wanted to play the exact character my mother had created in her head: mediocre, struggling, and completely irrelevant. It was a tactical move because I knew exactly what was coming. I arrived at Chloe's Winnetka mansion at 6 in the evening. The whole family was already there, 20 people in total. Uncle Richard and Aunt Diane were there with their 3 kids. Aunt Cynthia and her husband had brought their 2 arrogant college-aged children, and there were a few distant relatives whose names I could barely remember. And of course there were Chloe, Miles, and their 2 kids who went to private school. My mother immediately threw her arms around Chloe in the foyer, telling her she looked absolutely breathtaking and asking if her dress was from the new Chanel spring line. Chloe smiled, saying it was a surprise from Miles. Then my mother turned her head and her eyes swept over me. She greeted me and remarked that my dress looked very warm, using the word warm like it was a synonym for cheap. I just smiled and thanked her. When we walked into the oversized formal dining room, the massive table was already fully set. It had a pure white linen tablecloth, baccarat crystal glasses, and a centerpiece made of holly and winter berries. Every single seat had a gold-stamped name card. I found my card all the way at the very end of the table, wedged between 2 teenage cousins who were glued to their phones. Chloe's card, on the other hand, was right next to my mother's at the absolute center of the room. I sat down, a faint smile hitting my face. It was absolutely perfect. I knew that the more humiliating they made the setup, the more explosive the retaliation would be. Just then, Grandpa Arthur walked into the dining room, leaning on his cane. The dinner started with the appetizers. There was high-end caviar and oysters flown in fresh, and expensive wine was flowing like water. Every conversation revolved around Miles's dizzying salary, the Ivy League summer camps Chloe's kids were going to, and various relatives bragging about their lives. I didn't say a single word. I just watched. Grandpa sat diagonally across from me doing the exact same thing. Before the main course was served, my mother stood up. She tapped her silver knife against her crystal glass, and the noisy room went completely quiet. 20 faces turned to look at her at once. She started a heartfelt speech about how incredibly blessed they were, talking about how Chloe had married a senior partner who wielded massive influence on Wall Street and managed billions of dollars. She announced that Miles had just become the true core of a top 10 hedge fund in the country. The room erupted into thunderous applause. Miles modestly raised his glass, and Chloe basked in the absolute peak of her vanity. Then my mother's expression suddenly shifted. She looked down the long table, casting a patronizing glance toward my seat at the far end. She told the room that of course they were proud of both of their daughters, using that sympathetic, apologetic tone that always made me sick to my stomach. She told everyone that while one daughter had married a financial titan, the other, well, Claire was working for the government fixing routers and resetting passwords. The entire room instantly went dead silent. Someone set their glass down way too hard, causing a sharp clink to echo through the room. I could smell the rich aroma of the prime rib waiting in the kitchen, but the expensive truffle mashed potatoes sitting in the center of the table remained untouched. All 20 people were staring directly at me. Then my father pulled out his Prada wallet. He slipped out a brand new $100 bill and slid it across the white linen tablecloth. The bill glided past the sterling silver candlesticks and stopped right in front of my bone china plate. The face of Benjamin Franklin stared coldly up at me. My father looked me dead in the eye and told the geek to go fix the Wi-Fi upstairs. A few people burst out laughing, including Uncle Richard and the 2 teenagers playing on their phones next to me. It was a laugh filled with pure awkwardness and condescension. My father added that it was just a trade after all, and there was no shame in honest work. My mother tried to smooth things over, telling Richard to stop while letting out a nervous, dry chuckle. She told the room she was certain Claire worked very hard at her little computer repair job. I looked down at the $100 bill, then I looked up at my father. I reached out and picked it up. I folded it neatly in half, making a perfect crease, and then folded it in half again. I slipped it into the pocket of my unbranded black coat. Then, using the calmest, most emotionless voice I had ever used in my life, I looked at him and said, "Thanks, Dad." The room grew even quieter, and the air became suffocatingly thick. They were waiting for me to cry, or to slam the door and storm out, but I didn't give them the breakdown they wanted. Chloe looked down at her plate and softly mumbled my name. I told her I was completely fine. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair and mumbled that he was just making a joke, to which I replied that I knew. My mother tried to force everyone to move on, suggesting that we should just carve the beef. But before my father could even pick up the carving knife, the loud screech of a chair scraping against the floor cut through the room. Grandpa Arthur stood up. He was 80 years old, and even though his back was slightly hunched, the sheer authority radiating from him was completely unstoppable, looking just like he did when he used to command aircraft carriers. He called out my mother's name sharply. My mother looked completely taken aback and asked him what was wrong. He demanded that she tell everyone exactly what level her daughter actually worked at. She stammered, saying she had just told everyone that I did network logistics for the government. Grandpa cut her off and demanded her exact title. My mother's face completely froze, and she asked how she was supposed to know my exact title. Grandpa looked at her and told her that was the pathetic part of it all. The entire room seemed to freeze, and all 20 people stopped breathing. Grandpa's voice was as steady as steel, cold, and incredibly clear. He told the room my exact title: Executive Director for Critical Infrastructure Defense for the Midwest Joint Task Force of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Claire Vance. Total, dead silence followed. Uncle Richard was the first to break it, asking if that just meant I was some kind of foreman. Grandpa didn't pull any punches, telling him that it meant I was the supreme commander holding the digital lifeblood of the entire Midwest. He announced that my budget was $85 million, and that I commanded 200 elite federal agents and security engineers. I watched those facts detonate like artillery shells inside their brains. I watched their smug expressions completely crumble and distort. I watched the crystal glass in my mother's hand tilt, nearly spilling red wine all over her couture dress. Aunt Cynthia stammered, asking how big the department actually was. Grandpa intentionally slowed down his speech to repeat the numbers, emphasizing $85 million and 200 employees. My mother finally found her voice. She told Grandpa that it was impossible, that there had to be a complete mistake because if it were true, Claire would have told them. Grandpa fired right back, asking her if a single person in the family had ever bothered to ask me what I actually did, even once in the last 15 years. He reached into his suit jacket's inside pocket, pulled out that neatly folded newspaper clipping, and carefully smoothed it out. It was the close-up photo of me shaking hands with the governor, complete with that massive headline. He slid it across the long dining table, mimicking the exact way my father had pushed the $100 bill. The clipping was passed from one hand to another, and I closely watched the facial expressions of every single person who read it. It was a wave of pure confusion, sheer shock, and a sudden sense of deep awe. My mother's hands were shaking violently as she held the paper, staring intensely at the photograph of me standing shoulder to shoulder with the governor in a sharp, tailored business suit to accept that heavy metal. She looked up at me, her face completely crumbling as she asked why I had never told them. For the first time that night, I spoke more than just a few words. I looked at her and said it was because they had never once asked. That single sentence, encapsulating 15 years of pure condescension and neglect, hit every single person in that room like a physical slap to the face. Right at that exact moment, a heavy vibration shattered the silence. My phone, sitting inside my bag beneath the table, began buzzing furiously against the wooden leg of the chair, creating a loud, unmistakable rumble. Even on silent, the frantic rhythm of the alerts made it obvious that a maximum-level crisis was breaking out. Chloe whispered to me that my phone was going off. I pulled it out and saw 6 missed calls, all from the Federal Monitoring Center and flagged with a black emergency status. As I watched, the screen lit up yet again, showing an incoming call from the office of the Director of the Department of Homeland Security. My father's eyes went wide. He asked who could possibly be calling me like this on Christmas Eve. I glanced down at the screen and then looked around the dinner table, telling them that the clearing network for the Chicago Options Exchange was suffering a catastrophic failure due to a maximum-level ransomware intrusion. My mother's voice dropped to a faint whisper as she asked if someone else on duty could just handle it. The phone kept vibrating relentlessly in my hand as I stood up, telling them to excuse me because I absolutely had to take the call. I walked out into the foyer, but I deliberately left the double French doors leading into the dining room wide open. I wanted to make absolutely sure they heard every single word. I answered, identifying myself as Director Vance. The assistant director on the other end began briefing me rapidly, explaining that a massive, coordinated foreign cyber attack had just pierced the financial core of Illinois. 3 critical Tier 1 clearinghouses were actively being encrypted, threatening to freeze market liquidity at any second, and they needed my explicit authorization to execute a physical network kill switch. My entire demeanor shifted instantly into something fiercely professional, cold, and authoritative. I told him I was listening and asked exactly when the intrusion was first detected. Then I began issuing rapid-fire commands, telling him to patch in the FBI Cyber Division immediately and to activate the Alpha 7 blocking protocols. I ordered them to force a gateway reset on every single affected financial node, making it clear that preserving the core transaction repository was our absolute priority. I told him I wanted a complete forensics report on my desk by 5 a.m. the next morning, emphasizing that we were going to manage this personally. I told him to forget about Christmas because if that clearing center's capital chain snapped, the financial markets would open in pure chaos tomorrow, and ordered him to execute the plan immediately. I hung up and walked back to the dining table. The way those 20 faces looked at me now had completely changed. They were staring at me like I was a total stranger, a terrifying figure of absolute power. I slipped my phone back into my bag, apologized for the interruption, and casually asked where we had left off. Miles was the first one to break the silence. The smooth, confident voice of the Wall Street elite was entirely gone, replaced by an incredibly cautious tone. He asked if I directly interfaced with the top leadership of Homeland Security. I told him that in the event of a critical regional cyber crisis, my department takes orders directly from the Homeland Security Council. He asked if this happened often, to which I replied that it depended entirely on the threat level. I explained that during the peak of the recent ransomware waves, we had internal security briefings every single day, though normally it was just once a week. Chloe let out a sharp gasp, invoking God's name under her breath. But Grandpa wasn't done pulling triggers just yet. He leaned forward and told me to explain to the table exactly what kind of compliance review power I held. When a public humiliation is completely flipped upside down, you have 2 choices. You can either grind those people into the dirt, or you can maintain a higher level of dignity that leaves them suffocating in their own shame. I will always choose the latter. I looked calmly at Miles, explaining that my department handles the review and approval of cyber defense compliance protocols for every major institution across the Midwest, covering power, transit, healthcare, and of course all financial clearing networks. I noted that this included the foundational data services his own investment bank relied on. Miles's face turned completely pale as he quietly asked what that actually meant. I told him it meant data provenance, anti-money laundering encryption tracking, and cross-border fund blocking protocols, explaining that we run mandatory quarterly penetration testing on the digital vaults of every Tier 1 market participant. I paused for a beat, then added that just 4 weeks ago, on November 20th, I was the one who personally signed and approved the annual cybersecurity license for his hedge fund. The room became so quiet you could actually hear the ticking of a mechanical wristwatch on someone's arm. I told them that the only reason their capital pools hadn't been wiped out by foreign hackers in a single second was because my team was quietly taking all the bullets for them behind the scenes. I told them that without us holding up the foundation, they wouldn't be able to trade a single line of code, because that is what national security infrastructure actually means. Chloe stared straight at me as if I were a total alien. Uncle Richard cleared his throat and asked how I could possibly manage a massive, astronomical budget like $85 million. I told him it required scientific administration, explaining that I present annual proposals to the federal committee, handle quarterly audits, and negotiate multi-million-dollar technology procurements with top defense contractors. He asked if I had only studied computers and whether I actually understood finance. I told him that I held a dual master's degree from Purdue in information security and management, and that I had a dedicated budget analysis team of 7 senior actuaries working directly under me. One of the teenage cousins who had been glued to his phone suddenly blurted out a question asking how much money I actually made. My mother gasped loudly, telling him that was incredibly rude. But Grandpa happily answered for me, telling the room that I made a top-tier civil service salary. He announced that the last time he checked the public disclosures, my base salary combined with special retention bonuses put me well over $175,000 a year. The silver fork in my mother's hand clattered loudly against her bone china plate. Grandpa kept pressing the attack. He had waited 15 years for this exact moment, and he had absolutely no intention of stopping. He reminded the room that during last year's massive grid crisis, Claire's department had physically severed 40 infected municipal networks, blocked a Trojan horse meant to paralyze the entire Chicago transit system, and rebuilt the communication links for 4 field hospitals. He barked at them, saying that while she was working consecutive shifts to save the city, everyone else at the table was busy sending meaningless mass Christmas texts. Chloe's voice was visibly trembling as she murmured that she had completely no idea. Grandpa roared back that of course she didn't, because not a single one of them had ever opened their mouths to ask. He told them they were all too busy assuming Claire was a useless failure, entirely wrapped up in their own false sense of superiority. My father tried to defend himself, stammering that they had never explicitly said I was useless. I looked directly at him for the first time all night, telling him he didn't need to say it out loud, because his actions had proven it at every single family gathering for the last 15 years. My mother completely broke down into tears, sobbing out an apology and claiming she really didn't know. I looked deeply into her eyes, telling her that she wasn't ignorant, she just actively chose not to know, and that there was a massive difference between the two. She wept, asking why I had never corrected them sooner. I told her that I had corrected her, reminding her that I told her I worked for the cybersecurity agency and that I had been promoted. I told her she only ever heard the words computer repair, immediately writing me off because she didn't think it was prestigious enough. She cried, insisting that if she had known I ran such a massive department, she would have been so proud of me. I asked her if she really would have been. I reached into my pocket, pulled out that neatly folded $100 bill, and slapped it onto the table right in front of my father. I asked them if they wouldn't have just found another angle to look down on me, mocking me for not marrying rich, or for not having kids in private schools, or claiming my career wasn't feminine enough. My father's face turned completely grim as he told me I was being incredibly cruel. I asked him who was being cruel, compared to a father who gives his daughter a $100 tip to go fix the Wi-Fi in front of 20 relatives. The heavy weight of the truth hung in the air, completely undeniable. Chloe said softly that she knew I was in management, but she had assumed I was just a low-level supervisor leading a team of 2 or 3 people. She told me she should have asked for details, and said she was truly sorry. I nodded, telling her she absolutely should have asked, but she didn't. I reminded her that she had sat by and watched them humiliate me at every single holiday without saying a word, and that she had just smiled behind her wine glass whenever our mother introduced me as a tech support worker at baby showers. She stammered that she didn't mean it that way, but I told her she meant exactly that, because having a sister at the absolute bottom made her life as a wealthy trophy wife shine that much brighter. Chloe's eyes turned completely red as she mumbled another tearful apology. Miles placed his hand on Chloe's arm in a protective gesture, but I saw right through it for what it truly was. It was a display of sympathy for his wife, not a sign of support for me. I looked straight at her, telling her that I didn't hate her, but that I was completely done pretending we had any kind of sisterly bond. A few of my cousins and Uncle Richard started awkwardly apologizing, claiming they were genuinely kept in the dark the whole time. Aunt Cynthia turned a judgmental glare toward my mother, saying she couldn't believe Evelyn didn't even know her own daughter's true position. My mother tried to defend herself, stammering that I had never properly explained it to her, but Aunt Cynthia shut her down by aggressively asking if she had ever asked me even once. Nobody had an answer for that. I stood up and told everyone I was leaving, looking over at Grandpa to see if he was ready. He stood up too, grabbing his cane. My mother completely panicked, begging me not to leave and pleading that we could all sit down, talk this out, and fix it. I looked at her and told her a single conversation wasn't going to fix this. My voice was perfectly flat, without a single hint of emotion. I told her this wasn't an honest mistake. It was 15 years of her actively writing me off in her head every single day. I told her that every holiday, every dinner, and every single phone call was just her explicitly telling me I was a defective embarrassment to the family. She cried that she had never thought about me that way. But I told her she absolutely did. I told her it was in every word she spoke because I hadn't married a hedge fund partner, because I hadn't had kids, and because I chose an invisible battlefield she couldn't understand and openly despised. I told her she had decided I was a loser and then felt perfectly justified treating me like one. My father asked quietly what I wanted them to do. I actually stopped to think about it. What did I want from them? I told them I wanted them to understand that respect isn't a negotiable favor they can just hand out whenever they feel like it. I made it clear that if they ever wanted me around this family again, I would never attend another gathering where I was treated like a second-class citizen. I told them I refused to listen to any more comparisons to Chloe, and that I would never accept any disrespect toward my career. I told them that was my absolute baseline. My father looked entirely defeated and murmured that it was fair. My mother was completely sobbing by this point, crying out that we were supposed to be a family. I told her that being a family means protecting each other's dignity, and that they had never once done that for me. I told her that until they learned how to do that, I would be keeping my distance. I turned and walked toward the front door. Grandpa followed right behind me, his cane clicking heavily against the expensive hardwood floor. My mother screamed after me to wait, but I didn't look back. I pulled open the heavy mahogany front door, and the bitter, freezing December wind of Chicago came howling inside. Grandpa paused right at the threshold. He turned around one last time to look at my mother. He told her quietly that she had raised a hero who protects the digital security of tens of millions of people in this country every day. A high-ranking executive who manages an $85 million budget with absolute integrity and competence. And yet, in front of her entire family, she had called her a router technician. I heard my mother collapse into heavy sobs inside the house, crying that she didn't know. Grandpa looked at her and told her she should have known because she was my mother. He turned around and walked out into the winter night with me. The heavy front door slowly shut behind us, locking all the finger-pointing, the arguing, and the breakdowns inside. We carefully made our way down the icy steps, our breath turning into thick white plumes in the freezing air. Once we were safely inside my car, Grandpa asked me how I felt. I gripped the steering wheel with both hands, not rushing to start the engine. I sat in silence for a long time before the word finally came to me. Free. If you've ever had to draw a cold, hard line with the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally just to protect yourself, you know exactly how painful it is. But you also know exactly how necessary it is. If you resonate with that feeling, please leave a comment. I just want to know that I'm not alone out here. I drove Grandpa back to the south side. We ordered a massive spread of Chinese takeout, ate straight from the boxes on his coffee table, and watched It's a Wonderful Life on his small TV. Inside that slightly cramped old house, there was nothing but a deeply comfortable silence. During a commercial break, Grandpa suddenly asked me if he had been too harsh back there. I told him no, it was exactly what she needed to hear. I told him my mom was definitely going to start spamming my phone with calls, and he told me I should let her sweat for a while. I told him that was exactly the plan and that I wanted her to stew in it. He looked at me and thanked me for letting him see that happen. I squeezed his calloused hands and told him I would always be grateful to him, because he was the first person who ever really saw me. The phone inside my bag started vibrating. I pulled it out and saw Evelyn Vance on the screen. I flipped the ringer completely off, placed the phone face down on the table, and went right back to watching the movie. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt a deep, total peace. The week following Christmas was incredibly quiet. My mother called a dozen times, and I didn't answer a single one. Then the text messages started rolling in. On December 26th, she begged me to call her back, saying they needed to talk and that she had been so incredibly wrong. On December 28th, she texted saying she understood I was hurt, but claimed I really should have been upfront with them from the beginning. By December 29th, she was text-guilting me, saying I had completely humiliated her in front of the whole family and asking if it was really necessary to take things this far. On December 30th, I blocked her number. Work, on the other hand, was a completely different story. By 4 a.m. on Monday, I was already sitting in the command center managing the ransomware attack on the options exchange. By noon, my team had audited 30 core servers. By 6 p.m., we had isolated and destroyed the payload source, which had been planted through a third-party accounting software. Within a week, we had completely reset the security perimeter and restored the entire system to seamless live trading. One of my supervisors noticed how ruthlessly efficient I was being and remarked that I looked like a loaded gun. I just smiled and told him I had a fantastic Christmas. On January 5th, my phone rang again. It wasn't my mother this time. It was Chloe. I answered with a simple hello. She asked if we could please meet up, and after a moment of silence, I told her okay. We met at a coffee shop downtown. Chloe looked exhausted, nervously shredding a napkin in her hands. She brought a letter with her from Miles. It was typed out formally, but signed by hand at the bottom. It was awkward, but incredibly sincere. She told me Miles had wanted to apologize to me in person, but she had told him to give me some space first. I skimmed through it. Miles admitted his own arrogance and ignorance regarding the people working behind the scenes of our national infrastructure. He mentioned that just last week his hedge fund was facing a catastrophic systemic liquidity crisis, and my team had neutralized the threat in under 9 hours. He had actually called my department directly to express his gratitude and was completely stunned by the elite professionalism of my staff. I mentioned this to Chloe, noting that he sounded absolutely terrified and couldn't believe anyone in the government was that competent. Chloe confessed that he was terrified, and that both of them were. I told her that was the core of the problem. She looked at me for a long time before admitting that she had always known I wasn't just some low-level tech support worker. She told me she knew I had real authority, but she had never asked questions because it was simply easier not to. She admitted that maintaining the illusion our mother had built was the most convenient path for her. I told her she was exactly right. She apologized, and I told her she had been a willing accomplice for 15 years. She said she knew, and that she wanted to make it up to me. I told her she could, but that right now I needed time. When she asked if we could ever try to rebuild our relationship, I folded Miles's letter and slipped it into my bag. I told her we could try, but made it clear that if we were starting over, the rules were changing completely. I told her I was no longer the little sister sitting in the corner taking their scraps, and she said she understood completely. We finished our coffee in a very guarded atmosphere. It wasn't exactly warm, but it wasn't freezing cold anymore either. Maybe it was a new beginning, or maybe it was just a truce. In mid-January, my father sent me an email. The wording was stiff, but it came straight from the heart. He wrote that he owed me a formal apology. He explained that after working at the auto parts plant for 30 years, he had always felt like a piece of machinery that could be replaced at any moment. He admitted that when I chose to stay in the public sector instead of heading to Silicon Valley for a massive paycheck, he assumed I was repeating his mistakes. He told me he was wrong, and that I had found true purpose in my work, while he had just been working to survive. He apologized for being blind to the empire I had built, and said that if I gave him a chance, he would try to understand my world. He signed it, "Love, Dad." I read it twice before replying. I told him I would consider it, but reiterated my boundary that I would never attend another family event where I felt disrespected, making it clear that was non-negotiable. I hit send. At the end of January, my department held our delayed annual awards ceremony. Over 200 employees packed into the state building's massive auditorium. My team surprised me with a beautifully framed photo of all of us together, with me standing right at the center surrounded by the colleagues I had fought alongside in the digital trenches. The card was filled with signatures from everyone in the office. When I got back to my desk, I sat down to read the notes. One person wrote that I was the fiercest director they had ever worked for, thanking me for shielding them through the worst crises, and writing that I was the reason they chose to stay in this invisible line of work. I pinned that card to my corkboard, right next to all the medals, commendations, and department photos. These were the receipts of my life. They were the proof of my worth. That afternoon, the red secure phone on my desk rang. It was a direct call from Homeland Security headquarters in Washington, D.C. They told me congratulations, Director Vance, and informed me that my federal promotion had been officially approved. I was being tapped to move to D.C. to serve as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. My oversight would cover both the East Coast and the Midwest, and my salary was bumping up to $195,000 a year, with the official announcement dropping the following week. I thanked them and hung up. I sat back in my oversized ergonomic chair, looking up at the team photo on my wall. This was my real family. These were the people who had actually stood in the trenches with me, who recognized my worth, and who held up the entire defense line right beside me in the dark. In February 2026, my appointment was officially announced to the public. I packed up and moved out of Chicago, stepping into a high-level executive office in Washington, D.C. with a sweeping view of the city. Maintenance workers were out front installing a brand-new metal nameplate on my door that read, Claire Vance, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Cybersecurity. While I was sorting through some old cardboard boxes shipped from Chicago, I found that $100 bill tucked away in the deep corner of a drawer, the exact one from Christmas Eve. I had kept it all this time. I stared at it for a few seconds, then endorsed it and sent it off to Girls Who Code, along with a personal check for $5,000. I attached a small note that read, a tribute to all the invisible heroes quietly shining in the dark. In March, I agreed to have lunch with my parents. I picked a public upscale restaurant and capped the meeting at exactly 1 hour, even setting a countdown timer on my phone. The moment my mother sat down, she started crying. She told me she had spent the last 3 months reflecting on everything she had done. She admitted she was wrong, that she had been incredibly cruel, and that her deep-rooted fear of poverty and her own insecurities had completely blinded her from seeing how incredible her daughter truly was. I looked at her and told her she was absolutely right. She had been blind. She asked if I could ever forgive her, and I took a moment to think about it, looking at it through a purely rational lens. I told her that maybe I could one day, but not today. I told them that all I could offer right now was a very slow chance to get to know me all over again. My father asked what exactly they needed to do. I told them they needed to start treating me with the exact same respect they would show any high-ranking official. I told them never to compare me to Chloe in the same breath again, and that if they asked about my career, they had better actually lock in and listen. I made it clear that if they couldn't do that, we were completely cutting ties. My mother wiped her tears and asked if they could try. I told them they could, but warned her that I was only promising to maintain basic politeness on the surface, and absolutely nothing more. Right then, my 1-hour alarm went off. I stood up and walked away. There were no emotional hugs, and there was no magical healing, but that clear titanium-grade boundary made me feel incredibly grounded. Over the next few months, I began intentionally rebuilding my entire life. I was having dinners with Pentagon generals, keeping my non-negotiable Sunday video calls with Grandpa Arthur, and attending high-level, closed-door counter-terrorism briefings. My apartment was filled with photos of my colleagues and mentors, not my blood relatives. I was building my own chosen family, one based on mutual recognition and respect. In April, I was invited back to my alma mater, the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, to give the keynote address to the entire student body and faculty. The 1,000-seat auditorium was completely packed, with students, professors, and industry professionals crowding the aisles. I stood under the spotlights, talking about the invisible shields that protect this country, the baseline dignity that keeps modern civilization running, and the behind-the-scenes heroes who are treated like oxygen, completely unnoticed until the system crashes and everyone is suddenly suffocating. I spoke into the microphone, telling them that my grandfather had taught me that core work is still core work, whether your family understands it or not. I told them that the people blocking hacker intrusions at 2 a.m, the people maintaining the power grids, and the people monitoring foundational financial data are entirely invisible during peacetime. I said it's only when disaster strikes that the world suddenly remembers we exist, and I urged them never to measure their worth by the applause of others, but to do the work simply because it is incredibly important. The hall was dead silent. Then, someone started clapping, and within seconds, the entire room joined in. It turned into a thunderous, minutes-long standing ovation. Grandpa Arthur was sitting right there in the front row, using his old handkerchief to wipe away tears of pure pride. After the speech, a huge line of students waited to ask me questions. One young girl looked up at me and asked how I had managed to survive when the people closest to me had spent my entire life dragging me through the dirt. The image of that $100 bill sliding across the white tablecloth flashed through my mind, along with the echo of my mother calling me a router repair tech in front of 20 people, and the sting of those 15 forgotten years. I looked her in the eye and told her that I completely broke my addiction to external validation. I told her I found the people who could actually see what I was doing, and that as long as you have their eyes on you, it is more than enough. The girl nodded fiercely, scribbling my words into her notebook. That night, I got back to my hotel room in D.C. and opened my briefcase, finding a sticky note that one of my newly recruited analysts had slipped inside. It read, "Deputy Assistant Secretary Vance, I watched the live stream of your speech at UIUC. You are the only reason I didn't give up on this industry, because my parents also told me that foundational cyber defense was low-level grunt work. Thank you for showing me that we are the ones holding the handle of the knife." I read that note twice, very carefully tucking it into my personal journal. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from Grandpa. He told me I had commanded the room like a real general today and asked if I was coming back this weekend because he had picked up some high-quality aged ribeyes. I smiled and texted back, telling him to get the grill ready because I was bringing home the best bottle of wine I could find. Today, I'm still managing the massive, incredibly complex digital defense network of this country. Technically speaking, as a Deputy Assistant Secretary, I command several cross-regional joint intelligence units. I am still staring into the deep abyss that regular people never even see. Bank accounts remain secure. Traffic signals keep moving in order. Massive grid shutdowns are successfully blocked at our borders. All of that happens because of the exhausting effort that goes completely unnoticed, right up until the moment it fails. I have finally learned that being seen is not the same thing as having value. The most vital operations in this world almost always take place in the shadows, far away from any spotlight. It's the programmers with bloodshot eyes, the analysts glued to their radar screens, and the operators pulling up the defense lines before the storm hits. I don't mind being invisible at all anymore. In fact, I wear it like a badge of honor. I know exactly what I hold in my hands, and my team knows it too. The tens of millions of citizens across the Midwest and the East Coast who can swipe their credit cards and turn on their lights without a second thought get to sleep peacefully under my umbrella, even if they never learn the name Claire Vance. That is more than enough for me. As for my family, we are still in the middle of a very painful rebuilding process. It is bound to be an incredibly slow road, and every single inch of progress is built entirely on my ironclad boundaries. My mother and I speak over the phone once a month now, keeping the conversation strictly limited to the safest, most surface-level topics. She is clumsily trying to learn how to ask genuine questions about my life, and I am learning that forgiving someone doesn't mean deleting your memory. Chloe texts me every now and then, actively trying to shed her superficial country club persona. It isn't perfect, but it is a hell of a lot better than it used to be. For my birthday last month, my father sent me a card. Inside, he had handwritten a short note, telling me he was incredibly proud of me for fighting the battles he couldn't even begin to understand. That was enough. But at the end of the day, the true turning point was the peace I made with myself. I don't need my parents to stamp a seal of approval on my worth anymore. I don't need Chloe's guilt to feed my ego, and I certainly don't need anyone looking down from a pedestal to tell me that my life has meaning. I know better than anyone that what I do isn't just meaningful, it is the absolute bedrock of the modern world. And that kind of absolute, unbreakable self-certainty is the ultimate freedom. If this story struck a chord deep inside you, I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. If you've ever been stepped on by the very people who were supposed to be your absolute backbone, just remember that they can never extinguish the fire inside you. You are absolutely not fighting this battle alone. Thanks for listening.